Hey guys, so I'm gonna just briefly talk about the next chapter in the road to the American Civil War, and that starts with a piece of legislation called the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and its aftermath, which became known as Bleeding Kansas, almost a sort of mini civil war happening in the Kansas Territory in the years leading up to the actual American Civil War. So remember, after the Compromise of 1850, we have California as a free state, and we also have the Utah and New Mexico territories brought in as states that would use popular sovereignty to decide whether or not they would have slavery. So people in those territories would be able to have a vote to decide whether they would be free or slave states. Now, there's still a lot of unorganized territory here in the West that belongs to the United States but is not yet organized as states. And so the question again becomes, what is going to be, when those areas become states, what is going to be their relationship to slavery? So, in 1854, a senator named Stephen Douglas from Illinois proposed that the Nebraska Territory should be organized as a state according to popular sovereignty. Douglas had an interest in building a railway that went through Illinois into the West, and to do that he would need Nebraska and that unorganized territory to become a state. So this was kind of a personal pet project of his. He proposed to bring in Nebraska based on popular sovereignty, but he could not get it passed in Congress. The South didn't want Nebraska to come in under popular sovereignty because they were worried that it would become a free state. So Douglas changed the bill to separate this Nebraska territory into two separate territories, Nebraska in the north and Kansas in the south. So the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 says there's going to be two new territories, Nebraska and Kansas Territory, and they are going to be, the people there are going to decide whether or not to have slavery when they become states. So Nebraska, pretty much a foregone conclusion. People think that's really far north, that's going to be a free state. But Kansas, on the other hand, shares a border with a slave state, Missouri. So Kansas is actually above the Missouri Compromise line, above the 3630 line from the Missouri Compromise, but it's also next to a slave state. So 1854, Congress passes the bill, and now it's going to be up to the people of Kansas and Nebraska. Kansas is where it's going to be really controversial, but the people of those territories are going to get to vote on whether or not to have slavery. So what happens is people from north and south begin to rush to Kansas to settle it and try to influence the outcome of whether or not it becomes free or slave. So in 1855, there is a pro-slavery government established in Kansas. Groups of people called border ruffians come across the border from Missouri and kind of use threats and intimidation to force people to support the pro-slavery government. And this pro-slavery faction quickly comes up with a constitution and applies for statehood. It's, of course, a pro-slavery constitution. At the same time, or around the same time, there's a simultaneous anti-slavery government for Kansas organizing in the town of Lawrence. And they petitioned to enter the Union as a free state. So you actually have two separate governments in Kansas, both claiming to be the real government of Kansas, one pro-slavery, one anti-slavery, and they're both going to Congress, petitioning to being let in, saying we want to become a new state in the Union, and we're either going to have slavery or not have slavery. So you actually have two competing governments. This leads to violence breaking out in Kansas. You see here, Lecompton was the pro-slavery capital, and Lawrence was the anti-slavery capital. So you actually have kind of two parallel governments, two capitals, and two factions fighting over whether or not Kansas is going to be free or slave. This leads to essentially a mini civil war in Kansas, starting with the events of May 21st, 1856. A group of, quote, border ruffians from Missouri come over along with pro-slavery forces in Kansas and actually attack and burn the anti-slavery town of Lawrence. Although few people were killed, they burned a lot of the town. They specifically focused on burning the printing presses of anti-slavery newspapers in town. Shortly after that, John Brown, who we know later from his raid on Harper's Ferry but was in Kansas at the time, retaliated for the raid on Lawrence by attacking and killing 5 pro-slavery settlers near Pottawatomie Creek. So we see now, for the first time, this tension over slavery is really becoming violent. There's actually people being killed in the name of slavery and anti-slavery in Kansas over this struggle of the future of the state. And the violence just continues. There's more violence outbreaks around Lawrence. The situation just becomes more chaotic as these two factions fight in Kansas. And this kind of destroyed this idea of popular sovereignty as some kind of solution to the slavery question, because popular sovereignty, although it sounds nice and democratic maybe, really just on the ground led to essentially anarchy and violence as people just began to fight over whether the state would be free or slave. Eventually, Kansas would be admitted as a free state, but that was not until after the American Civil War had begun. So, this, again, was just a big controversy throughout the 1850s. Senator Charles Sumner actually gave a speech about the crime against Kansas, about what was going on in Kansas, Nebraska. He basically, yelled and criticized the South for interfering with democracy in Kansas, and in particular, after he supported or after he insulted a South Carolina pro-slavery settler named Andrew Butler. Butler's nephew actually attacked Sumner on the floor of Congress. He beat him really badly with a cane. You see here is the kind of artist depiction of Brooks beating Sumner. Sumner was an anti-slavery senator from Massachusetts, and as were many of the people who went to Kansas from Massachusetts. Massachusetts was a big hotbed of abolitionist and free soil sentiment. So, but anyway, Sumner got beaten on the floor of the Senate. So there's violence in Kansas. There's also violence on the floor of the Senate. And all of this just shows how the divisions between North and South are becoming deeper and deeper. And as their differences become harder to solve, people are more willing increasingly to turn to violence as a way to resolve the situation, because the political compromise just does not seem to be working. So you're getting deeper into this crisis, and really America's becoming really divided just in terms of their political reality, North and South just becoming so far apart, each one convinced that the other side is kind of creating a conspiracy to destroy their way of life. So we really see with events in Kansas and the fallout from the Kansas-Nebraska Act leading to just increasing tensions and violence in the United States as the 1950s goes on.